It's time to build momentum, to interrupt and end race-based hatred and violence.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here from the What Is Mine to Do Facebook group and from Intentional Inclusion Incorporated. And Momentum is our weekly time to just check in for 15 minutes or so, sometimes a little less, sometimes a tiny bit more, but to recommit to building momentum to interrupt and or end race-based hatred and violence. If this happens to be your first time, please check me out at tracybrown.com. We do work with leaders and organizations all over the U.S., specifically related to how do you take your commitment to be inclusive into every aspect of your business and personal life. But for the What Is Mine to Do group, we focus specifically on interrupting and ending race-based hatred and violence. Come check us out on the public Facebook group, What Is Mine to Do. You can also get a link to that if you go to whatisminetodo.com. So in Momentum this week, what are we going to talk about? Let's dive in. You know, so much we talk about race-based hatred and violence, and often our conversations are either around physical violence and the impact of that, another Black man killed while in police custody, or the person who's being attacked physically because of their race, or the Asian focused racial hatred and violence in response or reaction to COVID and literally attacking people who were of Asian descent. And so we do focus a lot on the violence, and that makes sense because none of us want violence to be the answer to any challenge or solution. However, what we also need to focus on is the verbal violence. Now, verbal violence in the form of racial slurs, or, you know, I'm walking through the mall and a little tiny group of white teenage boys somehow think it's funny and empowering to use the N-word as I'm walking by. That's verbal violence, yes. And that would be the first example that I use. But some of the language that we use, we don't even really think about how that might be verbal violence when we're not meaning it or using it to attack someone. So what I'm going to challenge myself and invite you to take the challenge as well is during the next week or so to be thinking about what kinds of words and phrases do I want to eliminate from my vocabulary, and or if I'm engaged with other people and I hear them use any of these words or phrases, how am I preparing myself to interrupt that in a general, in an instructive, and in a helpful way? So let's start with the one that is most obvious, and that would be racial slurs, right? If someone is using a code word for a particular racial identity group, and it's used in a negative connotation, then we can stop that, right? We can stop it in our own behavior. We can interrupt it when other people do the same thing. And it's not just the N word, there are racial slurs for so many different groups. And so when you hear that, are you prepared to correct that or to shift to something else? And one of the most powerful things that you can do is simply to use the person's name or their actual cultural identity. So if someone were in my presence and they were calling someone else using the M word, I would probably interrupt and say, well, actually, I know that person uses African American. Or if I don't know the specific identity group and I don't know the person, I have interrupted people and said, "Wow, I'm surprised. I'm surprised that you would use that term. Maybe you don't know it's derogatory, and you might just want to refer to them as a person, or you might just want to ask them what their cultural or ethnic background is." And that has happened with me a number of times, where there are people who are either Indian, and I don't know what part of India they are from, or they're Asian, and I'm not actually sure, and someone will use a term and it's inappropriate. So that's just one to think about. To instead of when you hear a racial slur, because if you're watching this, you probably never use one. But if you are in the presence of someone who does, then what could you do instead to interrupt that process or to educate or to move to a different use of language? Number two, oh, this phrase, I don't know about you, but I know for me, it just drives me crazy because often when people use it, well, if they say go back to where you came from, like it drives me crazy because I know so many people who came from the country they are in. They were born and raised in the country they are in, and someone is presuming they actually were raised somewhere else or born somewhere else. So it obviously is a phrase that's been used for centuries, to exclude mostly people of color and immigrants. And there are just so many US born citizens who have been targeted in this way. And so, an alternative obviously is to, if you know where the person is, there, if you're discussing origins and you actually are curious and you're not meaning to be offensive, although go back to where you come from, it came from is offensive. But if you're actually trying to learn and you're not in the go back to, even the question, well, where are you from, can be equally offensive if it is delivered in a way that makes it seem as if you're assuming they could not be a United States citizen or a Canadian citizen if you're in Canada, or a Mexican citizen if you're in Mexico, or whatever country you are in. And so you instead could have a conversation around, well, where is your family originally from? But even to me, that's actually not a little, it's a big iffy. I might say, what's your family's cultural heritage? I might ask the question if I'm really engaging with someone. I might say, I'm really curious about your family lineage because, and I don't know mine. I can't trace my family back before slavery in the US. And so there have been conversations I've had where I am curious about the lineage, not because I'm thinking this person must not be a citizen, but because I'm really curious. Now, if I'm in a situation where there is someone who is using it in a negative or pejorative way, go back to where you came from, or those people need to go back to where they came from, and there's nobody in the room. who is in that group, but they're just saying those people are, all those nurses that they brought over here, they need to go back to the Philippines. Like I've been in a hospital coaching session where that was creating a big issue or challenge on in that department of the hospital. And so, if I'm in a situation like that, then as someone who is um, committed to interrupting race-based hatred and violence, then I'll either do one of two things. I will offer a suggestion, like I will ask the question, what do you mean? What do you mean where they came from? And why would they need to go back there? So I'll actually kind of have that kind of questioning the assumptions that the person is making. Or if I take a different approach, then might actually do some coaching around what are the skills, right? What are the skills that they bring? Or what is it that you've learned from people who are from that part of the world? And often it'll be very combative. Absolutely nothing. I haven't learned anything and they just need to go back. And so then I might go into a framework of what are you trying to protect? What is the harm that has been created? And if I can do that from a level place where I'm not trying to debate you, I'm just trying to understand why you have such rabid veracity about pushing someone away or sending them away. So that phrase we want to not use, go back to where you came from, in a pejorative or condescending or angry way. Number 3, you people. Just saying it, right, it lumps everyone into a faceless group. It creates us versus them division. And it's especially in this context that we're talking about it today, when it is tied to negative racial stereotypes. So if you or someone in your presence uses that phrase, often I will ask them, so what do you mean about those people or you people if they're talking to me? What do you mean in your experience? What does that mean, or how did you experience that? And depending on the situation, I can ask that person, well, that really surprises me, which is a phrase, if you know me, I use a lot. It really surprises me that you would say that. It really surprises me that you would think that way. I don't quite understand it. Tell me more. So for me, that's become a go-to entry point. But in this case, with you people, especially if I'm a part of the group they're referring to, I might actually say, well, in your experience, what do people like me think? Or in your experience, what are the people you're grouping me with? How do they behave that you think is inappropriate? Like what is pissing you off about people like me? And did you actually experience that? And often they're working on a stereotype and it hasn't been their personal experience. And so, depending on who it is and what we're doing, I may invite them to think about other people they know who are a member of that group who have not displayed that behavior. Or I might shift to, oh, you people. Like, do you think that I think let's say all white people are rude and condescending and hate everybody who's not just like them? And I'll throw some stereotypes back to them, which often, not always, but often opens the door to a much more grounded conversation about lumping everybody into one group and the damage of stereotypes. So another one, let's see if I'm checking my time, and I'm going to go over my 15-minute goal because I do want to share 10 of these with you as food for thought. but I'll start going a little faster. So when people use the term thug and they're using it as a racial derogatory term, then of course we want to take the chance that we have to change that word. One of the best examples was when Hurricane Katrina happened, and in the news there were people who were breaking into stores or going into stores and acquiring supplies for themselves. And in the news stories where that was happening, and it was clear that there was someone who was black who was doing that, they were a thug. And when it was clear that there was someone who was white who was doing it, they were securing supplies for their family. Right? It was just they were doing the same thing, but by race they were labeled differently. And so when something like thugs is being used and it is racially oriented, then we want to interrupt that. Number 5, we have a lot of opportunity right now in our current society and world where we're hearing illegal aliens a lot. And it is a term that that from a perspective of interrupting race-based verbal hatred, that I ask people not to use, because it does criminalize many, if not all, in immigrants, and it dehumanizes them so that there can be negative stereotypes applied. And so it could be an undocumented immigrant, it could be a person without legal status, but not illegal alien, please. Number 6, third world. Now, third world didn't start out really as a negative term, but it became very dismissive during the Cold War from a political perspective. And what we know today is that when third world is used in contemporary 21st century conversations in the US and especially in the West, it is used to imply deficiency. It is used to imply backward or inferior. You can say developing nation, you could say the global economy, you could, and I recommend it highly, you could name the specific country you're referring to. And when it has been transformed in conversations now as kind of a joke, well, that's a third world thing. We say that's a first world problem because, people who are elite or who are the haves, it's a problem you have to have, but that you have to, it's a problem that you see exhibited in people who are more privileged financially or socially. And then we'll say that's first world, but we'll say a third world problem, such as poverty, which is systemic, or things that are happening in societies where large groups of people are disenfranchised. We need to address the issue and not talk about it as it's a third world problem, as if the people in those countries or in that part of the world are less valuable because they may have less money or less access to some things that we are used to. So when third world is not being used generically and it is being used pejoratively, we want to interrupt that. 7, Oriental is inappropriate to describe people. Please don't come to me with, 100 years ago in the 1920s or in the 1850s, that's the term. Yes, it was. And there are a lot of terms that we don't use that were used in the 1700s or the 1400s or the 1900s even. So just stop it. Just stop it. If you're talking about furniture, great. If you're talking about people, use Asian. Or if you know the specific ethnic background or cultural background, then use that. Number 8, tribal. When used to demean conflict or behavior, that's tribal behavior, or they're in tribal wars, right? That's inappropriate because it is pejorative, and it almost always is used to reflect discord between countries in Africa, or it's used to describe discord with indigenous communities all over the world, not just in the US, but indigenous communities, implying that they are primitive or irrational because they are not doing something, or they are not in agreement with what the mainstream or what the current political power is saying it is true. So instead of tribal, you can use group identity, you can use community based conflict, you can describe the specific cultural context. And if you don't know enough to do that, then maybe you should learn more about it before you dismiss it as, oh, those are just tribal wars. Number 9, ghetto. Now, what's funny is that I haven't actually heard this used a lot recently, um, or in recent years. And then this year, I've heard it begin to be back in the vocabulary a lot. When it is used to describe Black and Brown communities as undesirable or as low class, it's completely inappropriate. Initially, or if you go back in social science and behavioral science and sociology and anthropology, you will find some uses for the word ghetto that didn't have anything to do. It had to do with groups of people being and living together in areas, but it didn't have anything to do with specifically saying they're low class, or specifically identifying them as poor, or specifically identifying their behavior as inappropriate. And so you could talk about historically segregated neighborhoods. You could talk about and use urban if what you're saying is that, oh, this is an urban area, blah, 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 and it's really not race related. Or you can describe what your problem or challenge is that you're facing, but to use ghetto in an attacking way or in a pejorative way is not helpful and encourages violence. And last but not least for today, savage. Now, I have to laugh about this one because there was in the Black community, and then it expanded into more of a young adult, late teen, early 20s phrase, savage, thanks partially to Rihanna and her Fenty brand. And that savage became a good thing, I would say, in the last 5 years. But often when people who are, older are using the term savage, they're not using it as, oh, that is really cool, that is really avant garde, that is really going for what you want. And so it's inappropriate from a racial hatred and racial violence, verbal violence way, when it's being used to justify, like, oh, we had to colonize or we had to take over that because that group of people were just savages. And linking it to enslavement, linking it to colonization, linking it to the violence that we know, if we know anything at all about history, violence against indigenous people, violence against Africans. And savage became the term to actually imply they're less than human, they're less than we are, and we have to civilize them, or we have to train them, or we have to kill them, or we have to chain them. And so you can, if you are talking about those things, you can talk about violence. You can talk about brutality. You can talk about fears, depending, of course, on the context. So, all of these words and phrases, all of them, right, what they have in common is that they dehumanize people, they stereotype people in a negative way, and they are used to exclude people based on race and are very often tied to or connected to violence and or oppression. So the best practice that you want to keep in mind is to use accurate, respectful, people first language that emphasizes individuality, that emphasizes humanity, that demonstrates respect. This is our challenge for the week. Um, this has been the longest episode of Momentum since we started doing this. And I want to say sorry, not sorry, because this is foundational for all of us who have made a commitment to interrupting race-based hatred and violence. My name is Tracy Brown. Please join me over in the What Is Mine to Do group on Facebook, or simply check out whatisminetodo.com. We'll see you again next week, right here on Monday, for next week's episode of Let's Build Momentum.